But what if I told you that there are more than 1,000 pyramids in Northeast Africa? Kushites pyramids differ from those of Egypt. They are smaller, steeper, and made of red sandstone. There are 1,000 pyramids that have been discovered in Sudan, and over 300 still standing.
I know that when one says pyramids, Egypt comes to mind, but contrary to popular belief, Egypt isn't the pyramid capital of the world. In fact, Sudan has twice as many pyramids as Egypt. You see, northern Sudan was once home to the Nubian kingdom of Kush, a powerful ancient empire that birthed black pharaohs and one of Africa's earliest civilizations. There's so much to be said about the history of the kingdom of Kush, but in short, this civilization thrived in the 8th century BC thanks in part to their agricultural complex, and as such, erected a multitude of monuments honoring their gods and people. With inspiration from ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, they built over 200 pyramids, which although infused with different influences, still had their own distinctive features. Now, while the Nubian pyramids aren't as old or as large as the Egyptian ones, what's interesting is that they weren't just reserved for kings or queens. Nobles could be buried in them too. Sadly though, a lack of preservation, sand erosion, looting, and 2 civil wars took its toll on these historic monuments. However, these striking pyramids were named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2011, so remember, even if Egypt's pyramids are the most talked about, they're not the only ones.
Or that they were built with the help of aliens.
Yo, yo, yo! Here we go! This is a Pinkwinati production. From the Sagittarius arm Earth to the Orion planet. Welcome to your new Earth. Welcome to your new normal.
Or they were built with the help of aliens. Build pyramids very similar to those of Egypt. Most of the people around the globe still wonder from what history tells us. In this video, we are going to look at a specific kingdom that happened to be closer to the Egyptians. Mainly, the pyramids were the tombs of the pharaohs of Egypt. Pharaohs were mummified with amulets and jewels inside the linen wrappings and then buried in lots of coffins inside coffins to protect a body, later to be placed inside a prepared room in the pyramid. It's long been a common belief that the pyramids were built by the slaves. That's what the Greek historian Herodotus claimed, and it's a view that has persisted right through to Hollywood. But that belief was to be shattered by a series of extraordinary discoveries which began in the late 20th century. The theory of the archaeologists suggests that the pyramids were built by the ancient Egyptians under the pharaoh's order. Others suggest that they are the remains of the ancient civilization, or many people only knows about the 3 famous pyramids of Egypt. But what if I told you that there are more than 1,000 pyramids in Northeast Africa? And the majority of them are in Sudan. The Kingdom of Kush. Kush in northern Sudan is one of the forgotten kingdoms of Africa and the ancient world. The kings of Kush reached the zenith of their power in the 8th century BC, when they conquered their neighbor Egypt. And their influence extended as far as the modern-day Middle East. The Kingdom of Kush emerged from the ancient civilization of Kerma around 2500 BC. Kerma, located along the Nile River, was characterized by its advanced urban centers, skilled craftsmanship, and extensive trade networks. Both kingdoms were hostile and complementary, and over the centuries the balance of power would shift from one to the other. In the writing of history, mostly by the Western scholars, the importance of ancient Sudan was rather overlooked. They always thought of Kerma as it was always copying Egypt. Kerma was a very advanced state. Its civilization predated Babylon, Rome, and Greece. means that the exchange of ideas went both ways, not just being a receiver from Egypt. By 1500 BC, Egypt began to exert influence over the region, leading to a period of Egyptian domination. During the New Kingdom period of Egypt around 1550 to 1070 BCE, Kush was firmly under Egyptian control, with Egyptian governors ruling the territory. However, by the end of the New Kingdom, Kush began to assert its independence and emerged as a significant power in its own right. The first capital of the independent kingdom of Kush was Napata, situated near the fourth cataract of the Nile. By the early 8th century BC, ancient Egypt's fighting capability was much diminished. The kingdom had grown weak and couldn't ward off the invaders. Egypt came under the rule of princes from Libya who had their own traditions and religion and had no regard whatsoever for those of the Egyptians. This was a source of great dismay for the Kushites. Through the centuries of interaction, the Kushites had religion and culture similar to those of ancient Egyptians. By 750 BC, the Kushites had had enough of the decadence of the Libyan princes and their allies in Egypt. At that time, Kush was ruled by a king called Kashta, and he believed it was his duty to save Egyptians from further ruin. From there, he decided to invade Egypt. Kashta's army was known for the skill of its horsemanship, and they were very fierce archers. They would dip their arrows in poison to make it more deadly, and their specialty was to shoot their opponents in the eye. Kashta's army first took Thebes, the religious capital of Egypt. For the most part, Kushites were welcomed by the Egyptians, grateful that their co-religionists were fighting off the Libyans. With Thebes secured, Kashta opened the doors for his successors to follow his footsteps and continue to rule Egypt. Kushite kings expanded their influence northward into Egypt, ruling as the 25th dynasty of Egypt for almost 100 years from 747 to 656 BC, with 5 kings from Kush ruling the kingdom. This period saw a blending of Egyptian and Nubian cultures. Kush had adopted most of Kerma's culture and used to build their own type of pyramids, where they also used to bury their kings and queens. The Kushites' pyramids differ from those of Egypt. They are smaller, steeper, and made of red sandstone. There are 1,000 pyramids that have been discovered in Sudan, and over 300 still standing. In Egypt, there are about 100 pyramids. And you wonder why less people knows about the Sudanese pyramids, and also Sudanese pyramids receive fewer thousands of tourists per year. Is there a real reason for this, or is it that Sudan doesn't promote its history? Or due to the political instability that has been around in Sudan for many years, prevents people from visiting one of the best wonders of the world? In the 7th century BC, the Assyrians, under King Esarhaddon, invaded and conquered much of Kush, including Napata. Despite Assyrian rule, Kush maintained some degree of autonomy and continued to participate in regional trade networks. However, the Assyrian conquest weakened Kush, leading to its decline as a major power in the region. Around the 4th century BC, the capital of Kush shifted southward to Meroe, near the 6th cataract of the Nile. This marked the beginning of the Meroitic period around 4th century BC to 4th century CE. The Meroitic period is characterized by the development of the Meroitic script, an indigenous writing system. Also, this period saw the flourishing of Meroitic art and architecture. Kush continued to engage in trade with Egypt, the Mediterranean world, and other African kingdoms, exporting goods such as iron, ivory, and gold. The ironwork in Meroe can be compared to the Industrial Revolution in Western countries around the 18th century. The abundance of iron ore led to the working of iron. People began to farm, and Meroe became a central point for commerce. The Kushites also built their pyramids that would also serve as tombs for their kings and queens. but it wasn't until the 3rd century BC that the kings and queens were buried there. The Kushites built there some of the finest tombs and pyramids, and the tips of the pyramids were made in gold, but they were ripped and plundered by the Western archaeologists. The kings and queens were both buried with luxury jewels and other belongings, but they were also ruined and stolen by Westerners. They built temples, palaces, and other monuments, but few of them were preserved from being ruined. To this day, few of the buildings still stands due to lack of maintenance and protection. Now, let us dive into the matter of why does the pyramids of Sudan not mentioned much as the Egyptian ones? Even in the history books of Africa, they are never spoken about. The majority of the Sudan natives don't have much knowledge on their ancestors' history. Most of this outcome is based on the history of Africa always being written by non-Africans, and they always leave most of the critical moments in the history of Africa. This is why Africans to this day have less knowledge about its history, from its ancient religion, architecture, and other practices from the past. It is time that the true history comes out and deletes the narratives of the West that always hides most of the rich history of Africa, to avoid the Africans to know more about their true self. This benefits the Western by keeping Africans ignorant and taking advantage of them. Remember, whoever controls the past controls the future.
This megalithic marvel is dated by mainstream academia to go back to the prehistoric period of at least 4000 BC. Likely making it the oldest underground necropolis temple in the world. However, one of the best preserved and most mysterious sites found on Malta is hidden underground. Malta is one of the most mysterious islands in the world. A prehistoric civilization once thrived here, building megalithic sites all over the landscape. One such site is a temple complex known as Gigantia that likely features some of the oldest Cyclopean blocks on the planet. Now, legends abound of a race of ancient giants that once ruled this island. For example, this very site of Gigantia, oral traditions whisper that a giant named Sansuna is said to have actually constructed this site. Now, unlike many other megalithic sites found around the globe in places such as Peru or Egypt that are made of granite, most of the stone on the island of Malta is limestone, which is much softer than granite. Therefore, all the sites that are above ground here on Malta are severely eroded by the ages of time. However, one of the best preserved and most mysterious sites found on Malta is hidden underground. Known as the Hypogeum Hall Saflini, this subterranean labyrinth of interconnecting elliptical chambers was hewn and engineered straight from the limestone bedrock and features 3 different levels. Hypogeum is a Greek word, I believe, that means underground. And it has been estimated that more than 2,000 tons of limestone were likely quarried out and removed for its construction. A UNESCO World Heritage Site, this megalithic marvel is dated by mainstream academia to go back to the prehistoric period of at least 4000 BC, likely making it the oldest underground necropolis temple in the world. But could it actually be even older than that? Now, this entire structure is believed to have once been covered in prehistory by a surface shrine or a temple structure that covered it, but was eventually destroyed later on. And when it was destroyed, it obviously would have covered up the entrances into this labyrinth underneath. So I guess that's the silver lining with the overhead structure falling apart, is it basically kept the subterranean part hidden for thousands upon thousands of years. Because it wasn't until 1902 when the structure was uncovered by accident, when workers began construction on a nearby housing development. So they find the structure. A year later in 1903, the first excavations of the site began, and they were led by a Jesuit father who was also an archaeologist named Emmanuel Maugry. Now, this first archaeologist, Maugry, oversaw the project for 5 years until his sudden death in 1907. Now, sadly, his notes disappeared along with him, and efforts to find and retrieve them have been unsuccessful. The Hal Saflieni Hypogeum is one of the best preserved and most extensive ancient structures that have survived into modern times. Now, the ground level of the site features this trilithon-style stone entrance and also a shaft that descends down to this mid-level. The mid-level descends down to about 20 feet below the ground level, and it's the largest of all the levels. It's got over 20 different chambers on this mid-level. And on this mid-level are a few more trilithon stone-style entrances that were also constructed. Now, the most fascinating part of this mid-level chamber, if not the entire hypogeum, is what is known as the oracle chamber. And this gets me excited because this contains a carved out niche in the wall with a rounded interior surface. Now, anything spoken into this niche produces an echo which reverberates throughout the entire hypogeum. And apparently echoes from the speaking chamber or this oracle chamber reverberate into a rhythm that is similar to the human heartbeat. So it's like a word spoken in this oracle chamber is magnified over and over, apparently almost like 100-fold, and it's audible throughout the entire structure. According to some accounts, it creates an effect that is like being inside a giant bell. And at certain pitches, the listener feels the sound literally almost vibrating in their bones and tissues as much as they hear it in their ears. According to arts and architecture critic Richard Storm, who's been inside this resonance chamber, he says, quote, "Because you sense something coming from somewhere else you can't identify, you are transfixed," end quote. Also, Maltese composer Ruben Zara and an Italian research team found that sound resonates at 110 hertz within the oracle chamber. Research done by the University of Siena has shown that the construction of the chamber was made in a way to affect the psyche of people. Some researchers even believe this chamber was most likely the place where the priests would produce sound that would enhance the effectivity of their strange rituals. More and more research seems to be finding that the effect on the psyche of the ancients through acoustic properties suggests the builders of these sites had knowledge of this process and probably used it to enhance their rituals. So it's amazing that without the use of modern day metals, these ancients of Malta were erecting one of the first domed structures on Earth that incorporated highly advanced acoustics. Again, very similar to what I've seen in Peru and in many places in Egypt. I've also got to point out that on this level, this mid-level, is what's known as the painted chamber by some. And it features these spiral and honeycomb designs made of red ochre, this mineral pigment. And these decorations are elaborate, and supposedly they're the only prehistoric wall paintings found on the Maltese Islands. There's also a circular chamber on the mid-level that's known as the Snake Pit. And this is where some of the most fascinating artifacts discovered in the hypogeum were found, in this Snake Pit chamber. And one of them depicts what is a woman lying on a bed or couch. And it's come to be known as the Sleeping Lady. Now, Temi Zamet, the second archaeologist who took over for the first one, and this guy was excavating in the early 1900s as well, he stated that he believed this statue of the Sleeping Lady represented a priestess dreaming near the sacred places in the hope of obtaining inspiration to declare the words of the holy oracle. Now, underneath the mid-level is the third level, which is closed to the public, but it descends down to 33 feet below ground level. We're definitely going to get more into the third level at the end of this episode, and I'm going to share with you a very strange account that supposedly happened in this third level, so don't miss that. But first, let's talk about the skulls. Now, after the sudden death of the original archaeologist Emmanuel Magri in 1907, excavations continued under this archaeologist named Temi Zamet. Now, it's important to point out that Zamet proved himself to be not merely an archaeologist, but he was a brilliant medical doctor, apparently one of Malta's best ever doctors. And so by virtue of his medical training, it's also known that he was a very capable physical anthropologist. So that's, I think, very important to note when we read about what Temi Zamet stated regarding all the skeletons and skulls that were discovered inside the hypogeum. So in 1926, Temi Zamet states that he discovered over 7,000, that's right, 7,000 skeletons piled within various chambers of the hypogeum. And he described most of the skulls as being, quote, of the long variety, end quote. Now, one of Zamet's students who was excavating under his supervision was named W.A. Griffiths. And he stated in the book written by Zamet that, quote, most of the rooms were found to be half filled with earth, human bones, and broken pottery. It has been estimated that the ruins contained the bones of 33,000 persons, mostly adults. Practically all were found in the greatest disorder, and there had evidently been no regular burial of a complete body, end quote. Now, these numbers that these original excavators are using are incredible. I mean, we're hearing 33,000 possible skeletons represented, 7,000 skeletons piled up. This is crazy. In one particular area that Zamet and his team excavated, they write how the bones lay so thickly that in a space of about 4 cubic yards lay the remains of no less than 120 individuals. So this thing was literally packed with human bones and skeletons. And I might talk about this in a little bit, but I don't believe this hypogeum was originally just built to be a burial tomb. I think that as years went on, later civilizations and inhabitants used it to bury their dead and just throw them in there. Now, as I began to look into these skulls deeper and read the writings of these original archaeologists and other researchers that I'm going to reference here soon, it's obvious that these skulls feature strange genetic anomalies. Some of that would include cranial knitting lines, abnormally developed temporal partitions.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Delicious things to eat.
The popcorn can't be beat. The sparkling drinks are just dandy. The chocolate bars and the candy. So let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Say crack my fingers 3 times.
Crack my finger, crack my finger, crack my finger.
Okay, now this is the hard part. Say crack my finger backward.
Finger my crack, finger my crack, finger my crack.
Turn around real quick.
I ain't been turn around. Oh man, what the man? Why you do that man?
Do what?
I told you I was doing that no man.
What you
You
mean?
did it again, man.
Did what?
Look.
These skulls feature strange genetic anomalies. There's even evidence of drilling and swelling at the back of the heads. And these elongated skulls are also missing the sagittal sutures. That to me is very genetic. Now, it is known and been documented by some that some of these skulls were on display in the Archaeological Museum in Valletta on Malta up until the early 1980s. However, after 1985, all the skulls that had been found in the hypogeum, along with other elongated skulls found across multiple ancient sites on Malta, were all removed from public display by Heritage Malta. This is the authority responsible for Malta's prehistoric heritage. Now, Heritage Malta insists that the skulls have been available for scientific research. However, only a handful of people seem to have actually been granted permission to view them. One of these people was Dr. Anton Mifsud, who published articles detailing the skull's elongation. Now, his research confirmed that the craniums were naturally long and not the result of head binding. Notice how I said that part kind of slow? Because that is always the answer I get back if I talk about elongated skulls or post a photo. Oh, that's cradle headboarding, or that's head binding. Yeah, many skulls are headboarded or head binded, and that's why the shape is altered. But there's many skulls on Earth, such as these, I believe, in Malta, that are naturally long. It means they were born that way. So again, this Dr. Anton Mifsud published articles detailing the skull's elongation on Malta, and the paper that I read through is called The Elite Longheads of Malta. So he's obviously insinuating that these long-headed, elongated skulled peoples or humanoids were elite, or were the ruling class of their age. That's interesting to think about. So in this publication, The Elite Longheads of Malta, Mifsud draws parallels and conclusions related to the Egyptian culture and their so-called serpent priests. Now, I believe it was the second archaeologist, Zamet, who wrote somewhere that the majority of the bones and skulls that they were finding inside the hypogeum basically fell to dust and crumbled upon the first touch, and that only about 20 of them really remained intact. Now, out of these 20, the whereabouts of only 6 of the skulls are supposedly currently known today. And what remains to testify of their existence and abnormality are the photos that this Dr. Anton Mifsud and his colleague, Dr. Charles Ventura, detailed in their books about the abnormalities of the skulls. During the 80s and 90s, this Dr. Anton Mifsud managed to capture a few photographs of the then surviving 6 skulls that were exhibited at the National Museum of Archaeology in Valletta. So if you're watching this by video, you're going to see now or soon photos of these skulls on the screen. So in his publication titled The Elite Longheads of Malta, Mifsud stated, quote, "Great reluctance prevails on the part of several members of the local archaeological establishment to acknowledge the true nature of our Maltese ancestors. The evidence of Paleolithic art in Malta has been wiped out. At the present time, the long-headedness of the late Neolithic Maltese is being challenged in the very same spot where these people practiced their religious rituals, in the Hal Saflieni hypogeum." End quote. So from a guy who's spent a lifetime researching the hypogeum and these skulls found inside and traveling to Malta, or he might even live in Malta actually, this Mifsud, those are some pretty damning statements about the mainstream archaeological community and the seemingly cover-up that has ensued regarding the site and these skulls. Now, Mifsud goes on to write in his book that the 2 publications that had measured the skulls in 1910 and 1911 both pronounced all the hypogeum skulls as long-headed or elongated. And the 1910 measurements had been carried out in accordance with the rules laid down by the International Congress for the Unification of Craniometric Measures of 1907. 2 men by the name of Vittorio di Cesar and Adriano Forgione of Hera magazine in Rome, Italy. These were the 2 only non-officials to obtain permission, apparently, to investigate these hypogeum skulls. And they published a very thorough article regarding their findings. Now, their research confirmed that the cranium of these skulls was naturally long and not the result of bandaging or boards. And they couldn't find any evidence of median knitting or sagittal sutures. Now, in 1920, National Geographic magazine, in their January to June issue, reported that the first inhabitants of Malta were a race with elongated skulls. And in the article, they wrote, quote, "From an examination of the skeletons of the polished Stone Age, it appears that the early inhabitants of Malta were a race of long-skulled people of lower medium height, akin to the early people of Egypt, who spread westward along the north coast of Africa, whence some went to Malta and Sicily and others to Sardinia and Spain," end quote. So to me, it's ironic that we've got National Geographic, which today is considered the mainstream gatekeeper, or one of them, of all things history, right? In the 1920s, they're writing that these rulers of Malta were elongated skulled peoples. Now, this next paragraph I'm going to read you really caught my attention. I've heard a lot about this story over the years and always been intrigued by it, but I had never heard this part until just a couple weeks ago. Anton Mifsud, author and researcher who wrote this book called The Elite Longheads of Malta, in writing about the cover-up of this site and these skulls, he writes the following, quote, "The entire structure had risked total collapse during its refurbishment because of neglect. Crucial artifacts, such as a painted bull, had been erased from one of the walls on the second level, and a large 6-fingered hand had been engraved on another wall, had been obscured into oblivion. These acts had been perpetrated through the irresponsible activities of certain senior archaeologists," end quote. And he's again talking about his visits to the hypogeum in the 80s and 90s, I believe. Mifsud also wrote that in 1973, a very large quantity of human remains were also discovered at a smaller hypogeum site in Santa Lucia, called the Santa Lucia Hypogeum. And these have never ever been exhibited as well, and their present day whereabouts is unknown. Let's wrap this up by getting back to the topic of the third level of the hypogeum. I believe it was the second archaeologist, Zamet, who wrote that a number of 7 specific steps led from the middle level of the hypogeum down towards the lower level. And remember that I stated earlier, the third level descends down to 33 feet below ground level. And this third level is now closed to the public. And there may be a reason for this. Again, according to National Geographic magazine, in their August 1940 publication, they wrote an article that was titled "Wanderers A-Wheel in Malta." And the subheading was "Tragedy in Malta's Tunneled Maze." And this is written by the author Richard Walter. And I'm going to read it for you now. Quote, "Prehistoric man built temples and chambers in these vaults. In a pit beside one sacrificial altar lie thousands of human skeletons. While we cycled homeward, our friends told us that the island was honeycombed with a network of underground passages, many of them catacombs. Years ago, one could walk underground from one end of Malta to the other, but all entrances were closed by the government because of a tragedy. On a sightseeing trip comparable to a nature study tour in our own schools, a number of elementary school children and their teachers descended into the tunneled maze and did not return. For weeks, mothers declared that they had heard wailing and screaming from underground, but numerous excavations and search parties brought no trace of the lost souls. After 3 weeks, they were finally given up for dead." So that is a literal article from the August 1940 National Geographic magazine. There's some other publications out there that I believe shared this story, but National Geographic would be the biggest. A crazy account, if true. And that to me is what is so amazing and mysterious about this site. You've got this beautiful island with these prehistoric megalithic structures all over the surface. We talked about one of the other ones at the beginning of the show. And then you've got the hypogeum itself, which is just incredible ancient engineering, subterranean. But it's not just that. You've got the oracle chamber. You've got resonance and acoustics. We've got artifacts of the sleeping lady. We've got these incredible, colorful red ochre paintings. We've got a depiction of a 6-fingered hand on one of the walls of the hypogeum. We've got all these skeletons with elongated skulls and odd genetic anomalies that were discovered inside the structure. And sadly, if true, we also have missing people that went down into this subterranean structure to the 3rd level and were never seen again. So you've got all these different aspects. To me, it makes for an incredible story. This is an incredible ancient structure full of so much mystery and intrigue. And it really brings so many questions to light. Why were all these elongated skulls in Malta removed from public display after 1985? And it wasn't, again, just from the hypogeum, but it was these other sites too, where naturally elongated skulls were discovered. Why are they now only available, apparently, to researchers? These should be the greatest artifacts and specimens on display there in the National Museum of Archaeology on Malta. You know, does this cover-up have anything to do with the sudden death of the original archaeologist, Emmanuel Magri, and his reports that disappeared? Why were they never found? Why were they never published? And why has the original numbers of skeletons changed from 33,000 to 7,000? I saw 100 somewhere down to 20, and now apparently there's only 6 left. I get that, you know, some skulls are going to crumble and they're just going to fall apart, but only 6. I also can't help but wonder, why were these ancient elongated skulled peoples or humanoids of Malta living underground? Were they somehow survivors of a great ancient cataclysm, maybe a solar disaster, solar flare, and they had to get underground to survive? And or were these elite, long-headed humanoids using this subterranean chamber for ritual purposes? Were they abducting normal humans on the surface and enslaving them underground? Were they using the resonance chamber to transfix, to hypnotize, to seduce their captives? Were these elongated skulled peoples hybrid humanoids of sorts? That's what I lean towards. Did these elongated skulls give them telepathic communication abilities? And does that relate again to the oracle chamber? So many questions regarding this site, but one thing is for certain: there's a whole lot of mystery in Malta.
This has been a Cincinnati production. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more videos. If you'd like to support the channel, links are in the description.